All right, we're going to continue on with the build process on this RX-7 Ultra, working on the landslide sight, and we're going to talk about some critical factors that are going to determine maximum distance or maximum adjustability for your sight. Stay tuned. So as I've gone through the process, kind of setting this sight up and starting to make adjustments, in the last video where I actually kind of started putting this sight together and setting it up, there's some setup issues that I came across based off of my particular way of anchoring and everything, right? Arrow weight, arrow poundage, all the moving parts that go into the trajectory of your bow. But I wanted to break down a few critical factors that really start to determine how your sight can be set up. And the first one I want to talk about is your anchor point. So I'm going to clip over to a video here that I recorded of myself and had my son help me out. A little bit shaky on the tape measure, but for demonstration purposes, what you're going to see is I'm going to draw my bow back and I'm going to anchor as I do now, right? I anchor and I kind of still come onto my string slightly so my nose comes down forward, making the adjustment from my peep sight a little bit lower. And again, everything we're talking about right now starting with anchor point. So if your anchor point, wherever you anchor and the type of release you're shooting are going to dictate your peep height, which is the first critical factor as to setting this sight up. So in the video here you'll see I draw my bow back, my son Dominic's going to put the tape up, and you're going to see this measurement on the peep sight to the arrow. And it's a little tough to see on the, I mean, I can do this on a draw board, but I wanted to do this at full draw so you can kind of see how my references implement or are added into this formula. So take a look at the first video, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to run the peep sight up. I run it up about 1/2 inch, maybe 5/8 of an inch, okay? And I actually slide my anchor point slightly down as to what would be more typical. As opposed to me going hard on the back end of my jaw, I kind of slide it down and back slightly to get that string angle still on my nose, still a good second reference, but my head's a little bit more upright. And in this position, I want you to see basically just sliding my anchor point, moving my anchor point slightly is going to make the peep sight come up. And in turn, when I go to shoot some arrows, and I'll show you here, the first arrow is I left the sight up. Okay, so I left the peep sight up, so the first arrow was actually when I ran the peep sight up and I had to move my entire sight up, and it was a 22-yard adjustment based off me moving that peep sight up. In turn, it made me move my housing up, and the way it correlated from my indicator pin on my sight was by 22 yards, approximately 22, 23 yards. Hit the spot with the top pin again. So this one small adjustment, this one critical factor as far as what it's gonna, you're limiting adjustments on the back end, on the finished product, start with here, your anchor point, okay? So again, if you're a person that anchors low on the jaw, you know, more of the style where you kind of use the back of your neck, which I do not recommend because there's a lot of variables there, you're gonna get that adjustment to go really high, and you're gonna have a ton of essential long-range adjustment on the back end. As far, it's up to you to be consistent on that. Again, if you're not using any solid reference points as an anchor, then it's tough to be consistent. Again, using the jaw, whether you use the lower part of the jaw line or the higher part of the jaw line, that's going to be, in my opinion, more consistent, but it's going to start to limit the distance. So again, just sliding that peep sight up made my sight come up, and it referenced it by 22 yards. So that's critical factor number one, is anchor point dictating your peep height. I did a video on this a while back, maybe a year ago, on long range shooting, and you know, this ties into it. This show is brought to you by Maven Optics. Head over to mavenbuilt.com, check out their full selection of gear and optics, and when you're getting ready to check out, make sure you enter the promo code ALPHAGIFT in full caps. Once again, that's ALPHAGIFT in full caps, and they're going to throw you in a free bonus gift with your next purchase of any set of optics. Now, back to the show. So number two, as we get into the second factor that's going to limit your maximum range. You know, it's your arrows you're shooting in conjunction with the poundage and your draw length. So the power stroke that your bow essentially is delivering is directly a result of your long range accuracy. And this is where guys that shoot, or gals, 26, 27, 27 and a half inch draw lengths at, you know, maybe 65 to 70 pounds max, you're not going to have the power stroke of somebody shooting 75, 80 pounds, or someone shooting 70 pounds at 31 inches of draw, for example. And then in turn, the arrow that you load in there is where it directly, you know, it's going to determine your trajectory. So, hypothetical here. If someone is shooting in this specific setup right now for me, 460 grain arrow-ish, 459, 460, 80 pounds, 29 inches of draw, 290, low 290 feet per second range, okay? Call it 290 for easy math. If I add 100 grains onto this arrow, that's going to roughly be 32 to 34 feet per second that I'm going to lose with that build. So to look at how 32 to 34 feet per second are going to affect your long range trajectory, it's going to be huge. All right, so again, to think that you're going to be able to have best of all worlds, possibly if you're, you know, long draw length guy or gal, a lot of poundage, you can get away with more. You can get away with shooting a heavier arrow. In my situation, I like to stay in that 275 to 285 feet per second range because of the trajectory. I'm comfortable with that, and I know that in doing so, I'm going to end up having an arrow that's 450 to 525, somewhere in that range, depending on the bow that I'm shooting, and that's where I'm comfortable shooting. That's what I'd like to be from a kinetic energy, momentum standpoint, and a speed standpoint. So then my sight is going to directly be affected on how far I can adjust it from there. So arrow weight, poundage, obviously draw force, your power stroke, I should say, is going to affect it. Number 3, where you set your pins is then kind of one of the last steps. Your amount of sight, I can move this sight bar down one more setting. It's not going to change anything as far as what my maximum distance is. The maximum distance of this specific setup with this specific arrow and the way that I'm anchoring is going to be determined based off of that previous measurement of my anchor point and my peep sight. In addition to that, the speed that correlates with the sight tape. Okay, so those things are going to determine when I lower this sight down, when it's going to actually get too close to where it's not going to impact the bottom of the sight. So that last factor, the last moving part that I'm going to talk about is your pin setup. Obviously, in my opinion, a single pin sight is the most accurate type of sight you can shoot. That's where when you see target shooters, 3D shooters shooting any type of tournament archery, and granted this is not knocking the bow hunting category of the division, I'm not talking about that, I'm talking about your highest level of competitive. They're shooting a single pin sight or a scope of some sort. With that being said, it's typically right in the middle of the housing, okay? If you are shooting that type of sight, you can go away from centering your peep on your housing. You can actually start to mess with peep sight to see what's most accurate. But when you're shooting a multiple pin sight, this is my opinion, I think it's best to center that ring on your peep sight and then go to your pin. If you have, like some people will do, for example, they'll set all these pins as low as they can go in that housing to achieve maximum distance. If I was to take this bottom pin in my sight and split the difference between where it is now with the bubble, I'd probably be able to get another 8 to 10 yards worth of distance, okay? However, that's going to in turn make my top pin, all 3 pins are going to be in that lower half of my peep sight, which I don't personally like. I would rather see centered on centered and see pins optically more in the center. Again, from a maximum distance standpoint, you can take a sight like this and run your bottom pin, if that's your indicator towards your sight tape, and run it as low as you want, low as you're comfortable with, to give you more distance. I personally like to see the pins more centered. Again, it's a preference thing, right? So, but if I was to take, if my setup was to change by moving anchor point slightly, in turn raises a peep sight, 1/2 an inch-ish, 5/8 of an inch, in turn making that distance taller, then I'm going to gain essentially 22 yards of maximum distance as it correlates to this specific setup. From there, if I was to take this sight, these pins in this sight, and run them down more, I would probably gain another 8 to 10 yards on my max distance. So right now, because I've already checked it, when I run this sight down and I set the stop for it, okay, I'm getting approximately 96, 97 yards on that bottom pin at its max setting, based off of my poundage, based off my arrow length, arrow weight, I should say, my draw length, all those moving parts, and how I anchor in relation to the peep sight. If I was to make those additional changes, keeping a constant of the draw weight, draw length, and arrow weight, I'm going to gain somewhere on this sight. I'd probably be able to shoot somewhere in that low 120s range, okay, 120 to 125, 127 potentially, by making a few adjustments. So, if your goal is to be able to practice maximum distance, long range, and have a reference to do so, then moving your pins down could be a good option. Moving your peep sight up slightly could be a good option if you can maintain a good form, good anchor. And those two things alone on a setup standpoint will give you max distance. The other thing, if you lighten up your arrow, you're going to be able to shoot further with a reference. So I'm not telling you what to do with your setup. I'm just telling you these are some of the moving parts that you can consider when you're adjusting your slider sight like this for maximum distance. One of the things I did not talk about was moving your sight in or out, and I didn't mention it too much on this because you can move your sight in or out and you can increase your pin gap or tighten your pin gap up. I don't have a lot of adjustment on this specific sight, so I'm more concerned with having it centered properly on my peep sight. So again, as that reference, and this is where it's all, there's so much subjectivity to your setup and how you adjust it based off your personal preferences of what's going to make you more accurate. So again, I like a 1/8 inch peep. That's what I have in here. I'm going to actually be putting a Hamskea peep in here when I get my new strings on. But just to start to get this bow, kind of get used to it, get the feel for the holding weight, the poundage, the draw cycle, and then starting to sight this bow in, I've just got the standard peep in there. But again, nonetheless, I'm not focusing too much on this because I only have maybe a 1/4 inch each direction. It's not going to make that big of an influence on pin spacing and or tightness on a setup. But you can gain a few more yards that way if you have a dovetail sight and you can play with that. So some of the moving parts to think about, like I said, as we continue on with the build, we want to just showcase some of the adjustability and some of the critical factors on what you can look at. Again, if that's your goal, is to, hey, I want to be able to practice as far as I can, so that way if I can practice at 120, 130, 150 yards with a reference, obviously, yeah, that your short game, your 50 and in, 60 and in is going to really, really improve based off of improving your long game. So hope you enjoyed the video. Like I said, kind of different topic just as far as more setup and features and characteristics that go into long range accuracy. So stay tuned. We're going to continue with talking about more components on the bow and even some releases here moving forward. So we'll talk to you guys soon.